The theater has a special place, but just kind of brings a smile to my face because when I was growing up, the hardest thing for me to do was to scrape up 10 cents to go to the movies.
82-year-old Rigas was sentenced to 15 years in prison. 51-year-old Timothy was sentenced to 20 years behind bars.
What words would you use to describe the Buffalo Sabres at the turn of the millennium? Chaos, turmoil, lack of money, goat head, Stanley Cup run, Pekka, Satan, Hasek? All these answers would be correct, yes. It is true that the Sabres, like the Bills, were in a dark place when 2000 came rolling around. But of course, the Sabres are still in Buffalo, here now in 2023, and when looking back at this incredibly strange story, it's remarkable that they are still here today. Now, why are the Sabres even in this position? Well, for anyone born after 2003, you probably wouldn't know. But for my long-running Sabres fans watching this video, watching me right now, I have a good idea that you know who I'm talking about and why the Sabres were here. The answer, it's pretty simple, but the story itself is quite fascinating, and it all revolves around a man that built himself up from rags to riches, essentially, coming from a tiny little town in Pennsylvania all the way to the big city, building up a cable empire, and then buying the Sabres, and then using both the Sabres and his telecoms company as a personal piggy bank, eventually landing himself in jail. Well, I'm talking about John Rigas, and he was somehow allowed to buy the Buffalo Sabres, and because of that, he almost drained them and ran them into the ground. Before we get to Mr. Rigas' legal troubles and eventual demise, though, let's examine how he even got into the door at the then HSBC Center. And it all starts with the Knox family. So if you've been a Sabres fan for some time or have been to a game, you have likely seen a couple of banners in the rafters with the initials SHK and NRK, and those are the initials of the two men that originally owned the Sabres, Seymour H. Knox and Northrop R. Knox. They were both third-generation members of the wildly rich Knox family, an old money family that were able to bring professional hockey to Buffalo in the first place. Both of them had a prototypical rich kid childhood and upbringing, with both working in numerous high-ranking executive positions at different financial institutions, like one was working at a bank and the other one was at an investment firm. But both Seymour and Northrop were heavily interested in professional sports, and remembering their roots in western New York, they attempted to bring the Oakland Seals to Buffalo back in 1967. The NHL denied this request, and instead they granted Buffalo an expansion franchise 3 years later. It was in 1970 that their dream of the Buffalo Sabres was first born, and over the next 27 years, these two guys became beloved in Buffalo. The Knoxes oversaw the exciting French Connection of the 1970s, consistent playoff appearances in the 80s. Dominic Hasek came into full form. The magical days of exciting playoff victories like
Housley giving it to Tucker, winds up, shooting, he scored! He scored!
Are you ready, Legion of Doom? Here come the Buffalo Sabres!
and eventually the end of the Memorial Auditorium's usage in 1996. And it was under the stewardship of Seymour that Buffalo's sports scene was greatly expanded, with him helping to establish the lacrosse team, the Buffalo Bandits. Not that Northrop wasn't involved or anything, but it felt like the Sabres were really Seymour's child, something that he carefully watched over and made sure it succeeded. And it was because of that passion that made himself and Northrop extremely popular in Buffalo. So when he passed away a month after the Sabres moved out of the Aud, it came as a huge blow for the city of Buffalo and the franchise. When he passed away, there was a huge void left in the franchise. Seymour had been the main driver of the Sabres, and with Northrop's health also declining, the decision was made for the Sabres to be sold. And it felt like there was no better successor to the Knoxes than one of the biggest investors in the franchise, John Rigas. Rigas, a man who prided an honest day's work and had traditional conservative family values, had poured $15 million of his own into the Sabres back in 1994. He had built up his wealth by becoming one of the biggest cable tycoons of the Northeast, founding and running Adelphia Communications Corporation. His business started in the 1950s, springing up in his hometown of Coudersport, where he would soon put that town on the map. And as his company soon turned into a corporation, the love and admiration soon spread his way, all the way, in fact, to Buffalo. 2 years later, that investment into the Sabres would be enough for Northrop to trust and handing over his brother's most coveted asset over to the Rigas family. The Rigases, in a slightly complicated takeover of the franchise, announced that he, along with his three sons, Timothy, Michael, and James, would be running the hockey club now. But the complicated part is that the company they also worked for, Adelphia Communications, also was listed as an owner. This complicated relationship later would somewhat be clarified by Timothy, who said that Adelphia would not have a stakes in the Sabres. Instead, according to a Buffalo Business First article from back near the time of the purchase, Patmos Inc., another firm held by the Rigases, would be the general partner. Patmos was basically another subsidiary company, another feeder company into the overall Adelphia machine. So yeah, even though Adelphia wasn't directly owning the Sabres franchise, it indirectly was, so as long as Adelphia didn't collapse or anything, the Sabres will be fine. Right? Right, said the Rigases as they strolled into total control of the franchise in 1997. And after they strolled into controlling this franchise, they soon found out that they had to pay off the debt from the construction of the new arena, HSBC Arena, now KeyBank Center, which came out to about $50 million. The Rigases, who also bought out other old investors of the Sabres, and not that long after the takeover, the team flourished. The Dominator was doing his thing, the Goatheads were very much in style, and the Sabres were now well on their way to making it back to the Stanley Cup Finals for the first time since 1975. Now, while the team was definitely a hardworking, defensively incredible, and sometimes boring unit, they were winning. And they were winning a lot of games, and their winning ways were enough to get the city of Buffalo firmly behind the Rigases. I remember reading an article written by disgraced Buffalo journalist Jerry Sullivan as to how John Rigas was definitely trying to present himself as a man of the working people. He would rarely ever sit in his executive lounge all that often, his executive suite. Instead, he'd be strolling around the 200s, 300s, the 100s, chatting with fans, walking with some of his assistants and other high-ranking employees, and telling them to write down little things that the fans said about them, whether that be good or bad. He was always trying to improve the Sabres, and that made the Sabres fans totally endear and love this man. Rigas was universally loved not only in his hometown of Coudersport, but in downtown Buffalo too. He didn't have to do much else for his rise to fame and acclaim to continue. Little did we know, us Buffalonians, that in just 2 years' time, the music would finally stop, and the Rigases would not be dancing anymore. Instead, they would be well on their way to a jail cell. Remember before when I said that the Rigases made Adelphia the Sabres owner in name only? Yeah, well, it was this habit of slightly overstepping that eventually cost the Rigas family, and it led to their eventual downfall. Actually, it wasn't quite slight, it was more of an absolutely arrogant and pitiful giant leap into overstepping that got them into trouble. See, while the Sabres were doing great on the ice, Adelphia, the company John Rigas founded and operated with his sons, was also doing fine. And not just fine, they were doing extremely well and had a reasonably good reputation during the mid-1990s. Through a couple of acquisitions into Virginia and South Florida, Adelphia found itself dominating the cable industry at the time. Their cash flow was incredibly good. Newfound revenue was being spent on improving existing infrastructure in their empire. This perfect storm would be seen in the financial results at the corporation, with their household growth rate nearly 25% above the national average, and sales were north of $300 million a year by 1993. With these promising results, Adelphia continued to grow through acquisitions of medium-sized cable companies, pouncing on a couple of markets that range from Puerto Rico to California. Now, if you're well versed in the corporate food chain, which I'm not as much I'd like to be, you come to understand that rapid acquisitions mean debt will be accumulated by Adelphia. But this didn't seem to deter John Rigas and his sons. And even as debts concerns on the board and within the corporation grew, the Rigases attempted to downplay it by pointing to the future, a future filled with a potential merger with another telecoms corporation. But once people started to look closer at Adelphia's debt, they realized that the money missing wasn't just because it was spent on buying other companies. No, it was much more deceptive than that. In March of 2002, Adelphia officials, after about a year of questions regarding their debt, finally disclosed how much the company owed to its loaners. The final tally came out to be about $2.3 billion, which was totally surprising for those working at the company. Well, surprising to everyone but the Rigases. You see, the Rigases were unmasked as the defrauders that they were shortly after this, as they had seemingly borrowed more money than was necessary. And then they turned around and purchased Adelphia stock with that Adelphia money that they had just taken out. Not only that, but they also took Adelphia money and bought things such as a personal chef, expensive office furniture, a private golf course for the Rigas family, and they had non-working members of the Rigas family on the payroll as well to pay them off. And to top off the entire pile of fraud, the Rigases also manipulated the books to make it look like the company was making more than they actually were. And they also inflated the number of subscribers the company had. And because of all of that, they plunged the company into a load of mess. This mess's debts would cost Adelphia about $18.6 billion, way over what Adelphia officials had previously disclosed. In the end, the amount of fraud and manipulation eventually cost the Rigases their jobs at the top of the company, and it would lead to an SEC investigation, and eventually it found that the Rigases were guilty of multiple counts of fraud. Now, plenty of other executives within the cable industry and other white-collar individuals criticized the SEC for their eventual harsh sentence against the Rigases, saying that the government agency was just trying to unjustly punish and make an example of Adelphia, after they were embarrassed by not catching the Enron scandal earlier than they did. Now, do you remember when I said that the Sabres' future well-being was tied to the well-being of the Rigases and Adelphia? Yeah, well, since they were going down the faucet, so were the Buffalo Sabres. 3 months after the initial news broke of John Rigas' multiple counts of fraud, Gary Bettman and the NHL seized control of the Buffalo Sabres. This was after John had agreed to step aside, owning the Sabres in name only from this point onwards. And this move only plunged the Sabres into more financial drama. Nobody was getting paid, deadlines were missed, and the debt from the construction of the HSBC arena still lingered, unpaid. $157 million in debt the Sabres were, and it was remarkable that the Sabres were able to stay alive. The Buffalo Sabres filed for bankruptcy around this time, and the whole franchise future was uncertain. It was during this time this all was happening when the NHL actively sought out potential parties to buy the Sabres. And it was also during this time that the legal actions against the John Rigas and his family started up. In July of 2002, the SEC officially charged Adelphia and the Rigas family with massive financial fraud. And in July 2002, nobody stepped forward to buy the Buffalo Sabres. There is one consortium that was rumored to maybe trying to buy the Sabres, with the leaders of that one being local businessmen Mark Hamister and Frank Duras. But a lack of funds eventually doomed that bid. An entire season was played without an owner, without a clear idea of whether or not the franchise would actually stay in Buffalo or not. The fans weren't showing up to the rink anymore, and for most of the games, Bettman multiple times voiced his displeasure with the fans not showing up and supporting their team. But it was after November and going into the 2003-04 season where the front runner was finally realized to become the next Sabres owner. His name was former New York gubernatorial candidate and Rochester businessman Tom Golisano. Golisano, who would later go and buy the Sabres, thus saving the team from potential financial demise or relocation, would help pay off the debts incurred by John Rigas, and he'd help to stabilize the franchise on the ice as well. Unfortunately, that stabilization would come at the cost of being bold in free agency, as multiple times during his reign, he'd let key players leave in free agency, namely Danny Briere and Chris Drury, and he'd see the potentially great Sabres team of the mid-2000s wither and die within a year of their famed and long Stanley Cup run during the year of 2006-07. But, and this is a big but, Golisano kept the team in Buffalo. He'd stay out of general operations, and he'd make sure the franchise made a profit in the NHL. And when he'd eventually sell the team after losing some interest, rumored, in 2011, the fans would reminisce on how he'd saved their team back in the early 2000s, and how he'd go on to saving them again by selling the team and the franchise to Tarion Kimpagula, a man who pledged to keep the Sabres in Buffalo. And Terry Pegula, by the way, would eventually promise that the Sabres would win a Stanley Cup under his watch. Yeah, that isn't going too well, is it? While Golisano won't be loved as much as the Knoxes were, he should be admired for stepping up to the plate when the Sabres desperately needed him, and to keep this team in Buffalo, because had he not been there, there was a real shot the Sabres were being relocated, or just outright folding. While the Sabres were being rehabilitated to good health by Tom Golisano, the opposite was happening for John Rigas and his sons in the legal field. After 2 years of being in legal limbo, the family's fate was finally secured when John and Timothy Rigas were convicted of securities and bank fraud, and for diverting more than $3 billion of company funds into their personal piggy bank. John was sentenced to 15 years in prison, and Timothy to 20, but neither would see a jail cell for a couple more years, as they and the rest of the family appealed their guilty verdicts. But in 2007, John Rigas finally stepped into a jail cell, and he wouldn't be let out until 2016 when he turned 91. He was granted a compassionate release and was allowed to live out his final years in solitude with his family in Coudersport, Pennsylvania. He tried to argue his innocence after his jail time, but nobody listened or cared outside of Coudersport. He eventually passed away in 2021, still pleading his innocence, still trying to save his legacy. But the Sabre had already pointed to his fate, to his legacy, and there was nothing he could do about it. It was a quick rise for John Rigas, a man who started back in the 1950s, built his wealth over the coming decades, and eventually bought the Buffalo Sabres in 1998, at the absolute pinnacle moment of his life. He steered the Sabres through some brief glory days in the late 1990s, namely their championship run in 1999, where they eventually came up short. He oversaw the fame and just the absolute lovingness that the fans had to the Goatheads and to himself. He promised at one point, too, given all the love, that he'd put Adelphia's headquarters in downtown Buffalo, build a new skyscraper, everything. But eventually, his arrogance and his family's just total ignorance to the situation and to their greediness and wealthiness led to them taking money from Adelphia's piggy bank, using it on themselves, and eventually being caught red-handed. Today, his legacy is complicated, as those in Coudersport hail him as a kind, loving man who was wronged by the big powers in the big cities and by the establishment. To everyone else, he was just a greedy businessman who eventually got too big for his britches and stole from the very company that built him up in the first place. What do you think? Do you think he's on the latter side? Did you think he purposely tried to run the Sabres and Adelphia into the ground and knew full well what he was doing? Or was he just a kind, loving old man that didn't know any better? Let me know. Thank you so much, folks, for watching. I was Don. This is Buffalo Sports Center. Make sure to hit that like button and subscribe, and I will see all of you in the next video. Peace.